What did the president accomplish with his attacks on Syria?
John, I think he accomplished two things. One is, I think he sent a very strong message to the Syrian president that he cannot use chemical weapons, that he cannot use sarin in the future. And I imagine that that will stick. I don't think Assad will use sarin again. I think that is deterrence worked here. I think the second message that was sent was to our other adversaries, primarily North Korea and Iran, that the United States, that this president will back up red lines, that he will protect the interests of the United States with military action if necessary. It's a very, very powerful message as well. I think what wasn't accomplished here was as important as what was. And what wasn't accomplished is we did not deter the Syrian president from continuing the war against his own people using conventional weapons.
I think what's important to focus on here is, if your priority is getting rid of ISIS and defeating ISIS in Syria, let's be clear, the Russians have not, nor the Syrian government of Assad have been our allies in that. They've done virtually nothing to defeat ISIS. They've focused, as Mike points out, on sort of their own people and the internal civil war there. And so, frankly, in some respects, if you want to get the leverage out of the missile bombing in Syria, if I were Secretary Tillerson, I would not be going to Russia. Boris Johnson of the UK canceled his trip. If you don't want to get drawn in, then you need to build a coalition. I'd be going to the Arab Gulf. Our Arab allies during the Obama administration offered military assistance to remove Assad from power. They weren't taken up on it then. Now's the time to go and build that coalition in the Arab Gulf and have them take on and follow on to what our attacks were to try and leverage them.
You cannot ultimately defeat ISIS without getting rid of Assad. He has no credibility with the largest percentage of his population, which are the Sunnis. He will never get it back. He will never get their support back. And as long as that's the case, as long as he's there, that will feed extremists. Whether it's this ISIS or whether it's ISIS 2.0 down the road, Assad has to go. They are connected.
Russia is in an actively hostile posture toward the United States and the West right now. Undertaking direct efforts to undermine the West and undermine the United States around the world, whether it be in Syria, in Ukraine, Crimea, up against NATO, Afghanistan, where they're supporting the Taliban. We've seen reports. So it's a very difficult time in this relationship. Second, I think if I were Secretary Tillerson, I would not go on this trip unless I were going to see Vladimir Putin. I don't think, frankly, that, and we've learned this through a lot of experience, that conversations with Foreign Minister Lavrov really get to much of anything. I think you have to be able to talk directly to President Putin, and Secretary Tillerson knows Putin. So it's a broader conversation. They'll certainly have the conversation about Syria and what they might do going forward, holding Russia accountable, but we have a broader conversation to have with Russia about really this kind of actively hostile posture we have vis-a-vis Russia in the world right now.
Shouldn't the Russians be punished, I guess, if you're going to, on the one hand, say we're going to punish somebody for a war crime and then you say somebody's complicit?
Right. Well, I actually don't think Secretary Tillerson went as far as you just did. I don't think he said they were either complicit or incompetent, basically, and he didn't say it. I think he should have. I think it's clear they were on the Shayrat Air Base with the Syrians, co-located. There's no way they were incompetent. They were certainly complicit.
There needs to be a lot more focus right now in terms of accountability and gathering evidence and pushing forward on war crimes prosecutions in Syria, including potential Russian complicity.
There's a perception in the media that the threat is down the road, right? That it's 2020 or 2022 when they'll have a deliverable nuclear weapon. They have that now. They have nuclear weapons that work. They have short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles that we know that work. They have two variants of an ICBM that they have not tested, but they've deployed one of those. The assessment of the United States is that they can mate a nuclear weapon to a missile. Both the former DNI said that, and the commander of NORAD said that. So the threat is now, and there's three threats. One is use, one is possible sale to a third party, and one is a loose nuke scenario if the regime ever collapses. What happens to those nuclear weapons? So the threat is now.
What did we learn with the Syrian operation about President Trump?
I think we learned a couple things, John. First, he was able to move quickly. The whole thing from the original attack to the U.S. counterattack, less than 2 days, in 70 hours or something like that, and in a limited, very limited way. That may have surprised some of his critics on the left. At the same time, he was able to, in opposition to his campaign rhetoric and much of his tweeting over the last years, go against his sort of isolationist perspective and actually intervene in a complicated situation overseas. What happens next, just as complicated. Third, he did it at a time when he was hosting a visit from the largest, the leader of the largest country in the world. That had to be interesting for the Chinese to watch, and it certainly sent a signal, I think, not only to his guests, but also other leaders around the world, that perhaps they had to recalculate how President Trump might think about his role overseas. And finally, he did this in a way that garnered bipartisan support, and I think then encouraged the public to follow.
It may be that the real foreign policy doctrine of this administration is keep them guessing, and not just in operational terms. If you think about what President Trump said in discussing these strikes, he said America has to stand for justice. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson said earlier in the week that we needed to act on behalf of the international community. That fits squarely in a liberal internationalist and neoconservative foreign policy establishment that Trump seemed to reject root and branch during the campaign. If you take that rhetoric of this week seriously, then the sorts of things Senator McCain is saying follow from it. If we really are going to stand for justice, we need to have a broader intervention in Syria.
On Tuesday, President Trump said, I don't want to be the president of the world. And on Wednesday, he said, I now have the responsibility. So I don't think we know yet what the Trump doctrine is. Is the Trump doctrine that if there is video of dead, beautiful babies, that we will act? Secretary Tillerson spoke about earlier chemical attacks that were not responded to. Or is it more of the logical conclusion that war crimes are war crimes, dead people are dead people, whether they are killed by barrel bombs or by chemical attacks? This is a data point, a really interesting one, as Michael said. We don't know precisely where it leads.
Some of his strongest and earliest supporters have been expressing some serious doubts about this action. I think the question really is it a one-off? If he gets more deeply involved in Syria, then I think that some of those people start becoming outright opponents of him. But if he doesn't, if he just moves on, then I don't think that happens. The other interesting thing is what happens to the opposition. Nothing the president has done has earned more praise from the Democrats than this military action this week, which is kind of odd in a way. They've been portraying him as this great menace until the moment he starts firing missiles, and then suddenly he's a statesman.
This isn't a job you can prepare for. You only get on-the-job training. Even those who are particularly qualified, which this one particularly wasn't, only can really understand what it's like once you're faced a test like this. On Wednesday, in that Rose Garden moment, there was this little bite of President Trump saying, I have the responsibility, just the day after the tweet about I don't want to be president, which made me think...
Of the world.
Yeah, of the world. Right, which is good, because he wasn't elected to that. But it made me think, oh, he now is finally putting on this, uniform for the first time, that it's just now kind of, on this respect, getting to him. And that's one of the things about whether it's his critics on the left or the right or his supporters or the people who don't like him are going to have to contend with, which is that every president grows into the job as they face the challenges and the inbox gets more complicated.